talking about in the Gospel of John in the series, The Word Became Flesh, about provision at the party. So just imagine, right, you're at the Super Bowl party, someone invited you over to their house, and you go over there, and you're watching the Super Bowl, and you're cheering for your team, or maybe just the least worst team that's there. That always seems to happen for me, but maybe it's differently for your teams. So you go over there, and then, there's like a ton of people, right? There's like 100 people at the Super Bowl party. And you're like, awesome, this is great. And then first quarter hits, and you're out of nachos, right? Nachos are gone, right? All of a sudden, like, you're going to have mutiny on your hands. And there's this guy hanging out there, and he's a third cousin. You know him well. And then all of a sudden, like, there's so many nachos you don't know what to do with yourself. And they're the best tasting nachos you've ever had in your life. And you're like, who went to the store to get all these nachos? Like, these are awesome. Like, these are like freshly made, homemade nachos. What in the world does this have to do with what we're going to talk about today? We're going to talk about partying. Now, before you get too crazy, I know some of you guys are like all of a sudden have your like red flags like up, like way up high. Like, whoa. Where are we going with this? I'll get there. Bear with me. We're going to walk through. Some of you guys are excited. Some of you guys are holding red flags. Depends on where you are. Party flag or red flag. I don't know which one you guys are holding. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and the wedding feast of Cana. And this is an interesting story. And I want to kind of frame this up before we jump into it. I think a lot of times as Christians, we usually fall under one or two sides when it comes to Jesus. We either, one, think of him, and we see his piety, and we see the righteous things he did, and the teaching that he did, and all these amazing things, and we see him like, oh man, like that, he's almost unapproachable. And that is true. Jesus is righteous. He is good. Everything he did, he was perfectly sinless. Only person to ever live who's perfectly sinless. He's also the Son of God, fully man, all these things. But there's also a human side to Jesus where he enjoyed being around people. He enjoyed being around his family. Jesus cried when Lazarus died, even though, like, a verse later, he raises him up from the dead. Jesus laughs with his disciples. He throws jokes out. I mean, like, this is a part of who Jesus is, and it's a real part of who Jesus is. And so sometimes we think of Jesus only in this kind of pious aspect of who Jesus is, and we forget that Jesus was a fun guy that people actually enjoyed being around. That's not a bad thing, but that is a good thing. Last week we talked about, sometimes as Christians we just need to embrace the weird and just be weird, and we do. But not at the expense of alienating people. That makes sense. It's a hard balance because we're called to be bold, courageous, all those things, and at the same time, people shouldn't hate being around you. They shouldn't. But a lot of times as Christians, people hate being around us. Why is that? Because honestly, we give them plenty of reason to hate being around us. And so when we look at the life of Jesus, here's a guy that people were just, they wanted to come be around him. They wanted to listen to him, even if they disagreed with him. You can find early on in the gospel accounts, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, what were they doing? They were listening to Jesus teach. They were hearing him preach before they finally got angry enough where they wanted to kill him. They were attracted to what he was saying. And I think we need to remember that as Christians. There's a balance because some of us embrace this too much and we ignore hard things. That's not what I'm saying today. Make sure you hear that. But on the flip side, we don't need to be jerks for Jesus. We don't. And some of us feel like that's a mantle we're going to take that on. We should be likable people. And at the same time, be courageous and bold and share the truth of the gospel. Now, in this story, we're going to talk about a couple of things here. We're going to talk about, this is the main point of the story, but we're going to talk about what's the view of alcohol here, scripturally, biblically. We're going to address that today. So, if you have angry things you want to tell me, please, we can get coffee and talk about those things, and you can yell at me later. I'll be happy to do that and hear those things. But I wanted to share with you, just honestly, scripturally, what the Bible has to say, and let the Bible speak for itself. So we're in John chapter 2. Let's go down in verse 1. It says, "On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there." So, third day, what is he talking about? Well, if you just remember from last week, Jesus met a couple of disciples. He called them out to follow him, Nathanael, Philip, Andrew, and Peter. Remember, so those guys are with him. They asked him, "Master, where are you staying?" They're following Jesus around as he goes and teaches and shares, and they're learning from him. They want him to be their rabbi, as their teacher. So he's doing that, and they're learning from him. They're learning all kinds of things. And so the third day, there's a wedding at Cana in Galilee. So Cana is about 9 miles away from Nazareth. Nazareth, probably in these days, would have been a small town. Some estimates view Nazareth maybe 500 people. So for some of you guys, maybe your graduating class was even bigger than that. So this is a small town. Everybody knows everybody. This is your family. These are your friends. You grew up with them. And then Cana, being 9 miles north, is an even smaller town than Nazareth was. So Cana, in all likelihood, would have been very connected to Nazareth. They would have had a lot of close relations and close ties, possibly even family ties. So it's like family reunion. Mary may have been related to some of the people in Cana. This may have been a cousin or some other distant relative that they would have known. So there's this wedding feast over there in Cana, Galilee. The mother of Jesus was there. And Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. So Jesus goes to this wedding, with his disciples. And verse 3, it says, "When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.'" So what's this talking about here? It's actually talking about real wine at the party, at the wedding feast that they had, and it ran out. So again, Super Bowl chips, it's gone. It's first quarter. Bad news situation is going on at this wedding feast. The mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." She's like, "Jesus, they have no wine. Why is this an issue?" All right, so don't think of yourselves in today's times, but think of yourselves back in those times. So the groom had spent a year as they were engaged to his bride, and he was supposed to be taking care of getting the house ready, doing all these things to make sure that he had prepared well for his bride. So, and that included all the way up into the wedding. So you have this wedding, and all of a sudden you don't know how to estimate how many people are going to be here, and you're not prepared for the amount of guests that are going to be here. That looks really bad on the father-in-law, right? I have a daughter, and when she gets to the point of dating, those guys are going to have a really high standard they're going to have to pass when they get through me, because that's just the standard I have for my daughter. So now just think about this. This groom is like, "Man, this is bad. This could have been even a relationship, like a cousin or something like that, to marry." So all of a sudden she's like, "Jesus, we have to do something about this." And I love Jesus' response in verse 4. "And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.'" So he gives a really interesting response to Mary, and he says, "Woman, my hour has not yet come. What does that have to do with me? Why are you asking me about this wine problem at this wedding?" So he's telling her, "My hour has not yet come." And you see this throughout the Gospels. Jesus would often do this. He would say, "My hour has not yet come." What's he talking about? We don't fully know exactly what he's talking about in detail because the Bible doesn't give us those hints or clues, but we do know, leading up to the crucifixion and resurrection, this was something that was planned throughout time and space. This was the point in time where Jesus was going to redeem mankind from their sin. And so we know what happens in the story. When Jesus starts doing crazy things, people start asking him lots of questions. And when they start asking him lots of questions, he gives them the truth, and they don't like the truth. He starts giving them things that sound blasphemous to them because he's claiming to be God. And so anybody who ever says in the gospel accounts, they say, "Well, Jesus never claimed to be God," you're not reading the gospel accounts because he claims to be God often. And John is one of those that he shows his godhood all throughout. So Jesus says, "I'm God." People wanted to stone him for that and kill him for that. So he knows when this starts coming out, my timeline is short. So my hour is not yet come, maybe meaning It's not yet time for all this to be revealed. But there is some more purpose to this. Verse 5. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So Mary kind of has this, okay, whatever Jesus tells you to do, just do it. And it's probably going to be really awesome if he does it. Just trust me on this. Just do whatever he tells you to do. So verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. If you were a Jew in these days, you had to wash everything. So you would have these jars sitting in your home, and they were meant to purify utensils and pots and all sorts of things before you ate. And now you handled unclean things. And there's going back to Genesis through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those were the laws in which you were told that you had to keep. And a lot of those were ritual purification. So these jars were made for that. And so there's a lot of eating going on at this party, a lot of fun stuff happening. And so they had to make sure that things are purified so they can keep the law and do what they were supposed to do. So as these jars of water were there, 20 to 30 gallons, verse 7, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. So they listened to what Jesus said, and they filled them up to the brim. Verse 8, and he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So the master of the feast would have been kind of like your wedding planner. Maybe it's equivalent to a DJ today. I don't know. But this is what he's there to do, is kind of make sure everybody's getting their food, everybody's got everything they need, and he's passing it out. And so they're bringing it to him. And so they took it. Verse 9, when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. So, master of the feast tastes this wine. He's like, this is interesting stuff. I don't know, this is different. And he calls the bridegroom, calls the groom over. Hey, you need to come over here for a second. Remember, because the groom's job is to prepare for the wedding. Verse 10, and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. So what's he saying? He's saying typically at a wedding, what you do is you put all the good stuff out when people still have their taste buds intact to taste. And then once they have had a lot and they no longer can taste it, you put the bad stuff out because they don't care anymore. So just for a second, I just want to dive into this. This is not the main point of the sermon. We just need to handle it because the text handles it. What do we do with things like alcohol? Right? Just a brief caveat. Now, the Bible is really clear and really open, really honest about what is sin. Drunkenness is a sin. The Bible talks about that in many, many places. Be filled with the Spirit, but don't be drunk, right? And it talks about this idea of not consuming something so much where that it consumes you. That you are addicted, that you consume in excess. And honestly, you got to think, too, culturally, we are a culture of excess. Like, American culture is way different than Jewish culture this day. So we have plenty, and we feast on plenty all the time. And we just consume, we consume, we consume, we consume, we consume. So it's a different mindset, just to wrap our minds around. But I want to make sure we understand what he's talking about here, that he's actually talking about real alcohol here. Now, what I'm not saying is I think it's perfectly fine, and I know many in the room do, that you say, you know what, I'm going to stay away from alcohol because I know what it does to me. I know I can't handle it. I know it's something that I don't know moderation. That word does not come into my language and vocabulary. I can't do that, and so I'm going to completely avoid it. I think that is an awesome thing to do. Because you know yourself, and you know what you're tempted with. You know the things that drag you down. You know the things that bring you to a point where you're not yourself, and you do lose control, and that's never a good thing. But I think what we do need to understand, though, is that alcohol in and of itself is not inherently sinful. Now, that may be something you've never heard before. But the Bible makes that pretty clear. Now think about this. The Son of God created wine at a party. This was the first recorded miracle we have of Jesus. In fact, John says this in a little bit, but this was the first of his signs, manifested his glory. Now, again, like I said, this is one of those issues, I think, in a church. How do you handle something like this? Well, I think on one hand, you have to think of each other. And you go, you know what? It's not something we're going to make a big deal because we realize this is something that could be a challenging issue to walk through depending on where you fit on the spectrum. And so you're thinking of each other, embracing the freedom we have in Christ, and yet at the same time thinking, how do I honor my brothers and sisters in this? Now, I think in that, if you want to enjoy in moderation that beverage, I think that's a fine thing to do. I think it's a biblical thing to do. I don't think it's against the Bible. But I do think if we're not careful, just like many of the other things that we take into excess, it can be a very dangerous thing, which the Bible also warns us about, that we can take into excess. So what do you do with that? It's a matter of freedom. It's a matter of conscience. Basically have people in your life, make sure that you have people who can hold you accountable. Some of you guys, maybe you do drink too much. And maybe you can't handle it, and you need to cut it out completely. That may be where you stand. And others of us, we need to be really careful not to cast judgment on our brothers and sisters who may feel differently than us on this issue, and that's okay, and that's not a bad thing. Again, I can walk you through further. If you have questions about this particular issue, we can talk more in depth about that, what that looks like, if you have more questions. But just wanted to kind of hang on there for a second. It's not the main point of the text, but we see that Jesus makes this party and makes this wine for the party is better. And he says in verse 11, this is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So first of his signs Jesus does is turn water into wine. Now, remember the purpose of John. John was written so that we may believe in him and have life in his name. Now, what's he trying to do here? What's he trying to display? Remember John chapter 1. The very first thing that it talks about Jesus, that he's the creator. The beauty of this miracle is that Jesus takes ordinary water and he changes it completely by creating wine. Now, the beauty of that is that you can't do that on your own. There's no chemical process where you can just take water and just wave your hands over it and it turns to wine. That doesn't happen. Jesus creates it from nothing. He just makes it. Boom. That's the creator God. And John is showing us this is not some ordinary guy. This is the Son of God. Make sure we understand that. And then manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Not only do we see the creator God, but the disciples got to see the creator God in Jesus. And even though they may not have fully grasped what was going on, all of a sudden things are changing. So, what do we do with this? Well, I think the first thing we see here is Jesus enjoyed the party. Jesus enjoyed the party. When we think about Christianity, and again, for some of us, when we think of the piety and the piousness and that aspect of Christianity, that is a real part of what we should be about as Christians. But we should really enjoy being around other people. And again, I know some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts, and I'm not saying that we have to spend all of our time around other people. Because some of you guys, you're like, that sounds terrible. Like, I can't do that. Like, I'd rather watch paint on a wall dry because that sounds terrible. And maybe it's more in the sense of just that we're open to other people, we're connected with other people, but community is a part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we need that community. We need brothers and sisters in Christ to be around us. And Jesus had his connection, probably was familial, but still, he went to the wedding feast. This is the very first thing we see him do in this miracle, is that he changes this wedding feast party and makes it way better than it was going to be. He helps out the groom save face with his father-in-law. I mean, this is what Jesus does in the wedding feast of Cana. Jesus enjoyed the party. I think there's, for some of us, sometimes it's okay to have fun. It's okay to enjoy that. And some of us need to loosen up a little bit. Because you know what? It's like you can be angry about every single thing in the world. You can be grumpy about every single thing that happens. But you know what? You're not hurting anybody but yourself. And you're not fostering this spirit for people to say, Jesus is good and I want more of Jesus. I think one of the worst things that Christians do, this may get me in trouble too, but we go into restaurants and we have a good meal and we give a pitiful tip to our waitresses. And we go, you know what? They don't really deserve it. They didn't work that hard. What kind of impact are you leaving on that waitress or waiter? Christians are jerks. That's what we're saying. And as we share grace with other people, we have to remember who was shown grace to first. God showed grace to you. He showed it to me. As a sinner dead in my trespasses and sins, rejecting Jesus, telling him, I don't care about you. I'm going to live my life the way that I want to. I could care less about your law. I'm going to live the way that I want, and I don't care. And Jesus says, I love you anyways. I'm going to die for you on the cross. I'm going to save you and redeem you. If you turn to follow me, you can be forgiven of your sins, and you're now one of my sons and daughters. Jesus displays that to me. That is plenty of things to be joyful about. I love Sunday mornings. I love just our praise team and just like the amazing musicians that are here at this church. We were just talking about that this last night with a couple of guys, and it's awesome. It's great. We don't have to feel like we're kind of like, man, this is, I don't know about this. This is like loud, and there's drums, and this is kind of, there's drums in the Bible. There's all kinds of stuff in the Bible to celebrate God. David's dancing so much so where he accidentally flashes the world around him. And this is a story in the Bible because he's excited that the ark of God is coming back into his city. This is in the Bible, for real. I'm not kidding. And this is the kind of thing that we should be happy to celebrate God. We should enjoy celebrating God. We worship God. It's not here to worship ourselves. We're not here to worship some other thing. We're here to worship God. I think one of the things I see problems with us, and we look at this way, is that when our view of Jesus is too rigid, we suck all the joy out of being a follower of Jesus. And we're supposed to be joyful. Again, not a fake joy, not a fake happy. I'm not talking about like pretending. I'm talking about really enjoying getting to know God and the depths of who God is and embracing that and celebrating that and living in that. That should be a good thing that we celebrate. Jesus enjoyed the party, and so should we. Second thing we see here is extraordinary faith for ordinary problems. Let's look at like Mary's life here, right? Mary goes and asks Jesus, tells him they have no wine, right? And when you read this story, it kind of seems like a really insignificant thing to ask Jesus. Like, if you know who Jesus is, right, the Son of God, you're going to ask him to fix the wine issue that's going on? Like, is there not other problems that we could be solving here? Like, that's the one we're going to deal with, is this one? Honestly, just reading this, and I'm like, oh man, like, I don't know about you, but sometimes it's hard to ask God to help me for things that seem trivial in your life. You go, I have a lot of trivial things. I'm not asking God with that one because that's just dumb. I want to save it for the good stuff. Like, so I'm like, I'll kind of do this myself. And then when I hit like a roadblock, and it's a really big roadblock, then I'll turn to Jesus and I'll start praying and asking him to maybe help me through this. And you think Mary has no problem asking Jesus. Of course, she's his earthly mom. But still, she's no problem asking Jesus, we have a wine problem. Can you help us, Jesus? And I think sometimes we forget that we should be in daily communion with God, often, over everything. Things that seem insignificant, things that seem trivial, things that just make us happy and we're excited about. Share it with God. He has communion with us, and he has opened up this door where we have relationship now with him through the blood of Jesus Christ. He wants us to have this connection. He wants us to talk to him. He wants us to share everything that seems trivial to him. Just think about, just for some of you guys in the room, if you're married or if you're dating, and you just think of the things that you talk about, to your spouse or maybe it's just a good friend, and you think those really close friends in your life that you have and you can just share anything with. And you talk about everything, right? But to a perfect stranger, you're not going to share all that stuff. You know, you're not going to share the small little details of your life and the little things, but that's the kind of relationship that God has allowed us to have with him. And he's opened up that door, and he wants to have that kind of close connection where we share everything. Now, of course, he's still omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful, sovereign, amazing God that he is. And yet he still wants to have this relationship with us. Extraordinary faith for ordinary problems. What if we started to believe that God could actually do the things in which we're praying and asking him to do? That we'd actually have faith that he could solve those things and work them out in a way that he wanted to. Now, does that mean he's always going to do it? No, we're not treating God like a vending machine. But he has extraordinary power, all powerful. We need to have extraordinary faith for ordinary problems. If your car breaks down, what do? For me, I'm like, oh, are you kidding me? This is like, not today. It's like it always happens at the worst possible time to have those problems. And you're like, I don't have time for this. So then you just get mad, you get angry, and then you're like trying to figure out, like, how are we going to do this? Okay, I don't have time to go get it fixed. Maybe it's a money issue to get it fixed. Extraordinary faith for ordinary problems. And then usually it's after I get really mad, and then I kind of realize, oh yeah, God, I didn't even turn to you. I didn't even ask you to talk to you about this. Like, why don't we just talk to him about everything that happens all throughout our day? Just say we treat God as our daily bread, that he's providing for us daily provision. He's our food, or he's our water. He's everything that we do. We need him daily to survive. That's the kind of faith in which we need to have in Jesus. Extraordinary faith for ordinary problems. And I think lastly, we see here, God is everything for his glory. You know, I think if we're not careful, right, the thing that distinguishes a prosperity gospel from the real gospel is that idea of treating God as the cosmic vending machine. You know, where we say, okay, God, I want more money, I want more security in my job, I want all these things, and you give them your checklist. You start throwing your checklist out and say, okay, this is what Bobby said I can do, so we should do this. It's not what I'm saying. I'm also not saying that God always grants you your request. But you think of it like this, God is a loving Father. He loves us. I think it for my own kids. I want them to have what I want to give them. I want to provide for them. I want to take care of them. I love them. And I want to do things that are above and beyond, you know, what they definitely not what they deserve. You know, I mean, we just base it on they wouldn't get anything, you know. So it's beyond what they deserve. It's what they don't deserve. I want to give to them because I love them. And that's the way that God sees us. As followers of him, as his children, he wants to give to us. Now, ultimately, everything God does is for his own glory. So God's got a bigger plan in place that's bigger than us. He's doing something greater than us. He's doing something in a bigger scope than the way in which we see it. Sometimes when you look at the little details of life and you get narrowed in on the small intricacies of like, okay, what's happening here? God, what are you doing? It's easy to get bogged down and go, I don't understand this. Don't understand. God, I've been asking you. I've been praying to you. Again, sharing the story. I don't know how many times I've prayed for God to heal my daughter. You know, that she would be okay and not have the issues that she has when she was born. And God chose not to fully heal her. You know, and that's not God's fault. What I have to realize in that is that I'm trusting that God's plan of displaying his glory, that he's doing something bigger than me. And he's doing something bigger than you. And God's ultimate plan is where we want to align ourselves in with him. And God is doing something greater. Again, John chapter 20, verse 31, he says, the purpose that he wrote the Gospel of John is that you may believe, and you may believe and have life in his name. So all that he's doing that so that we would believe, that his disciples would believe. This wedding feast at Cana ultimately probably was for his disciples, and maybe those servants who saw what happened. The master of ceremonies didn't know, maybe Mary knew, but not too many people knew, at least at first. Maybe that story spread, you know, throughout afterwards. But ultimately, his disciples, that was what this whole thing was for. And sometimes God allows things to happen. God does awesome things for us to see so that we may believe, or that he's just displaying his glory. He's showing his ultimate plan in place of what he's trying to do to redeem mankind to the ends of the earth. God does it all for his glories. And I think when we try to think of what is God doing in our lives, right? How do we understand what he's trying to do? How do we reconcile with the good things and the hard things and we go, God, what are you doing here? That's where faith comes into play. And faith is trusting God in his character, knowing that what he's doing is ultimately best, but still being bold and asking God for the impossible. Having that extraordinary faith for ordinary problems, and at the same time realizing that at the end of the day, God is displaying his glory, and that's what we should be praying for. I think when you look at things that don't quite go the way in which you plan them to go, maybe life is not taking the turns and shortcuts and straight ways that you were hoping it would make, and eventually you go, God, what are you doing? What if instead we looked at and said, God, what are you doing? Like, why aren't you giving me what I want you to give me? We looked at it and said, okay, God, how can you display your glory through this? God, how can you use me in this situation to display your glory? Maybe if your car breaks down, how do you display God's glory to the guy who's fixing your car? Maybe you have a conversation with the guy at the desk and you're thinking, man, okay, I'm just going to talk to this guy and he's having a bad day. And you're going to talk with him and you're going to share with him the gospel, and before you realize it, you're telling him about how great Jesus is, and you have a connection there. Or maybe it's at, again, we talked to this, but I don't know how many times at the hospital, we're talking to a nurse, we're talking to a neurosurgeon, guys that are often unattainable to talk to, and God's given us a connection, a face there that he's put us in, sovereignly. That's a way for us to display God's glory. How can God use you to display that glory, his glory, to the ends of the earth? I want to make sure that we understand, as we think about this particular story, again, that we are representatives of Jesus. And again, I want to make sure we have Jesus in the proper framework and light. When we understand that Jesus is both sovereign, he's righteous, he's all God, fully God, 100%, he's sinless, he's all the things that God is, and at the same time, he loves us, he enjoys laughter, he enjoys fun. That's a good thing. Should be a part of us as a body of Christ. So I hope that today's message is a little bit different, but I hope we realize and recognize what it means to be a follower of Jesus fully. Not just part of it, but in full. Do you have that aspect of Christ, of who he really is, and do you understand his divine plan to say, I'm going to just share his glory to the ends of the earth? How can God use you in that process? Or do you see Jesus, maybe your view of him is very rigid, and you go, you know what? I don't have a good view of Jesus. It's very rigid. I don't understand how God can do all those things, and that could be who he is in full. Let's pray.